Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We give parents the option to send their child to a private or religious or selective school, or alternatively, still give them the choice to attend a public school. You give the parents the ability to choose the option that they think is best suited to the interests of their child and what is going to be best for them in the future. A few things in this speech. Firstly, just quickly, a couple of things on setup, and then 2 points of substantive. First, on why we think this increases the autonomy, and secondly, why we think this worsens public education on GovBench. So firstly on setup, what do we think school choice looks like? Obviously, as I said in my intro, we think this looks like giving parents the option to send their children to different types of schools, religious, private, selective, etc. But we also think this looks like having significant access to these sorts of schools, where they're not necessarily centred in cities. We think that there is probably still access to these schools in more regional areas and regional centres that gives more people the option to attend, for example, a Catholic school if they think their child is best suited to attending a school like that. But secondly, we think there are also schemes to support parents to be able to do this, like where there's funding and concessions available for them to do this. Now moving on to why we think this is going to increase autonomy. So firstly here, we think it's particularly important for people with strong religious backgrounds, but also those who would benefit from the facilities and services provided from these other types of alternative education. And we think that public education is insufficient for these groups for a number of reasons. First thing to say here is that we think private and other alternative education probably offers a lot more specialist facilities which cater to the needs of specific groups. That looks like having better sporting facilities for kids who are like really into sport and really want to further that in their future, and the parents can make that decision to send them there, where they are able to get that access early on. The second thing here is on religious individuals who often don't have access to the support that they need in the public education system. They don't have access to things like prayer rooms, or don't have access to adequate meal requirements, because the system caters to kind of the broadest demographic and struggles to cater to these individual requirements. The final thing to say here is we think these schools are better able to cater to people of different academic aptitudes and give them the best chance of success. So why does it matter to give these groups that choice? Firstly, on specialist facilities, this is often the only way to realise the skills and dreams of these children. If they, for example, if you have an aspiring young soccer player, if they attend a school that has specialist facilities, specialist coaches that are able to further those kids' skills and further their potential, they're going to be better placed to have a better, more successful career if they go to these schools, rather than having to go to public school where they don't have access to those facilities and may not be able to get access to those facilities outside the education system. So we think it particularly benefits them. It's particularly important that we give these people access to these sorts of facilities. But secondly, on religious individuals, as I said, often public education just caters to the broadest demographic and has quite a secular approach, right? They don't have things like prayer rooms. They don't have things like adequate meal requirements for people who need them. And these specific requirements are just insufficient in the public education system. But also it means that these children are probably not around people like them. They probably feel like they're alienated because they don't have the specific support that they need, and they don't have their requirements and their support met. So that we think this is probably particularly bad for those children where they do value their religious traditions and things, and probably would feel better and more well supported if they were in an environment that caters to those needs. The final thing to say here is just on kids with differing academic aptitudes. We think it's far better if you're able to get kids who need to push themselves further than what they can do in the public education system by giving them the option to send them to a private or selective school where they are able to push themselves and they are able to have teachers cater to their needs in a way that you can't do in a public education system because you have such a broad variety of skill level and things. You just simply don't get the support that these kids need in the public education system. This is why we need the option for these kids to attend these sorts of schools. I'll take a few away from Josephine.
It's obviously unrealistic that every religious person would be able to afford private school. Don't you just make these public schools so much worse than all the other religious kids leave?
Well, if parents are able to be given concessions and schemes to be able to go, it probably increases the proportion of kids who are able to access these sorts of things. But also, if they see that like this is obviously going to be better for them, they're probably going to want to like instill their child in this sort of system. Now I'm going to move on to why we think this is going to worsen public education on government. First thing to say is we think there's like a scale problem, right? We think that the people accessing the specialist schools, the alternative schools, are likely to still be in the majority. We hear this admission from OG anyway. Not everyone is going to want this for their child. People will still value it at public education, probably still want to send their kids there, especially if that is what they can access. So it's unclear how much funding you're actually going to use up by still having other sorts of education available to these people. It's not like you're going to be taking away half the public education budget to fund these private schools. But we also think it's likely that, in this case anyway, it's likely public education will be still funded in these sorts of liberal democracies because people, it's likely a large portion of the population will still use public education facilities and therefore will want to hold the democracies to account to fund these schools and give their kids good education for those who choose not to opt in to the other system. The second thing here is on resource scarcity. We don't think there's enough capital to be able to get the amount of resources you need for everybody to attend a public school. We actually get more access to specialised facilities. We think schools probably take this trade-off. They probably want to invest in a particularly good sporting program or particularly good music program at a trade-off in some other sorts of facilities, because that is the demographic they cater to in these specialist schools. But also, where you try and allocate more money to like a wide range of public schools, you're probably just not going to do it properly. It's going to be a situation where you have a jack of all trades and master of none. It's just not going to be done well across the board in all areas. It's likely that you're going to like invest in some things, like maybe you will increase like prayer rooms in some schools, but like you're probably not going to be able to cater to like everybody's needs in a way that private education would be able to. Secondly, quick teachers. We think this is just going to be much worse for them when they're only forced to engage in the public education system. They can't use specialist skills without the facilities, and they're more likely to burn out when they are forced to deal with resource scarcity. And we think this is just going to lead to like a lack of retention of like good quality teachers. So proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank Ella for that speech and welcome DPM to continue OG's case.
Speaker, the issue with that case is that it ignores that putting money into these private schools necessarily involves taking money out of the public system. Firstly, in the info slide, it literally said things like tax deductions. It literally said things like the providing of government funding from a limited education funding pool to private schools. But we also note that Ineka gave you a lot of structural reasons as to why this locks public schools into a cycle of becoming worse and worse, and then receiving less and less funding, receiving less and less political advocacy. 3 responses in this speech. Firstly, on autonomy, why actually school choice meaningfully limits the autonomy of people that we should care about. Firstly, in response to material about specialist facilities. We would not specialist facilities and religious communities. We would also note here that, as we pointed out in POI, that can only be accessed by a small portion of the population, right? You have to have a sufficient amount of money to be able to pay into going to one of these private schools, right? Like a private school is not free, unlike a public school, right? They are also often a lot more geographically gated. They often have reasons to be gated as well, right? They are attempting to compete with other private schools, therefore they are attempting to make themselves stand out. They often do that by excluding students. They do that by maintaining a particular image. That means necessarily they often do it literally by calling themselves exclusive, right? Necessarily, those are things that result in gating students out. But we also note that a lot of the issues they want to talk about, like not being able to access prayer rooms, not being able to access specialist meals, are actually issues of funding, right? Like those are issues of public schools not being sufficiently funded. And anything that results in a reduction of funding of public schools actually causes like these issues to get significantly worse in the public education system. And as we noted, the majority of people are within the public education system, including the majority of minorities. In fact, often if you do not have money, and cannot therefore like access a lot of these expensive private schools, it is the best case scenario for these communities is actually that the most money possible is going into being able to fund prayer rooms at public schools and things like that. But also note here, we don't think that the autonomy of children is being maximised by sending them to religious schools. We actually think it is like maybe maximising parental autonomy, but school represents a really important like opportunity for children to grow into their autonomy and be able to be their own people, right? Like we think it's really good that public education is secular. It doesn't push any particular religious belief system. That means that people have the capacity to be exposed to different ideas, find their own way in the world. Like you don't get to pick what family you were born into. At some point you need to become your own person. This gives you an opportunity to pick and choose your ideologies, pick and choose the ways in which you want to interact with the world. It also gives you the capacity to interact with lots of different types of people, right? Like having like, for instance, either firstly, as we said, it gets a lot worse if all of the other members of your religious community are now in a private school. But also it's bad if you're a member of the majority and you never interact with anybody from a religious community because you are like, because they are all over in private schools where you never talk to them. But we also note like, a lot of the time like, religious schools are just like really pernicious, right? Like Catholic schools really aggressively indoctrinate you into things like abstinence-only sex ed. They tell you you're like gonna go to hell if you are gay. Like a lot of these things are really bad. We think that actually like exposing students to these is not necessarily good, and already parents are able to interact and teach their children, take their children to church, do all these other mechanisms via which they're able to access that autonomy. It was never explained to us why the education system, which job is to prepare people firstly for being like functional adults out in the world, and also for just like engaging in the workforce, for meeting certain economic KPIs and stuff like that, why that had to fulfill these particular religious autonomous obligations. Next here, why are public schools made so much worse when school choice is available? A few things here. Firstly, they claimed that students were able to push themselves further in specialist academic schools. We know that's just fundamentally regressive. That looks like the government giving the most money to the students who least need it. Students that are academically excelling are winning under the current system. They do not need more money. In fact, what this system does is selective schools often receive more government funding because of their prestige and they're perceived as a good investment. That means that therefore money is taken away from students that are struggling, who might need extra support, who might need things like specialist programs written for them, who might need things like teachers' aides. That money is taken out of them and given to them to students that were going to succeed in either world, that would succeed in the average public school. We think that's actually really bad. We would also note that a lot of their specialisation around stuff like being able to have sporting facilities only exists as a conversation because of the systematic underfunding of public schools, right? Like we think also public schools have the capacity to other remedies for this, right? Like if you have one public school in a district that has a swimming pool and you want to have a swimming program, all the other public schools can share that. That's a lot harder to do when you have like a private school that's going to be much more gated and wanting to make the exclusivity around their material stuff. Like you're just able to get those economies of scale in the public sector that you're not able to get. You can do that specialisation just better when you fund public schools better and when more people go to public schools. But note here next, necessarily, why does this result in like worse outcomes? Why does this like reduce the amount of funding overall for the public schools? For a few reasons. Firstly, we note that just like a lot of the time, like we note that the groups of people that are likely to leave and go to private schools are often the top sections of people, like the top sections in terms of income, and often the way that is linked academic achievement at these schools. That means two things. Firstly, that you lose out on those potential future donations when those people are like upper middle class in the future, as unfortunately class tends to, run in families. But then also note that means that you lose out just like on the political capital of having those people often be the most invested people in the political system. Note here, it's not enough to say that a lot of people will still be going to public schools, so public schools will be funded well. That's not what we see under the status quo. But also note that public schools necessarily often cater to the least privileged and least politically engaged sections of the population. Think very few people who are Liberal Party politicians ever went to a goddamn public school, right? Often these groups have often necessarily it will be the people with the most power that are able to offset that. We also know that this system is cyclical, right? like, as these schools get, like, worse, as these schools, like, essentially, like, lose their top academic achievers, that means that therefore you, like, you therefore, like, have a reduction in standardized test scores. The public school system is perceived as failing. That results in two things. Firstly, those schools often independently get their funding docked because it's often linked to standardized test scores. Secondly, it also means that, like, conservative politicians are able to push for further and further school choice legislation, further and further defunding public schools. It wasn't enough for them to say that there was always going to be a stopgap, not necessarily, that reduces the funding for the most vulnerable. And note here, you cannot put everyone into a private school simply for the fact that public schools are free and private schools cost money. And even if you could, those private schools are going to be run by, like, for-profit educational providers, as we see in the US, or by churches or by religious institutions, which either mean they're incredibly gated or they're run for profit in such a way as they have, like, very little interest for the cheapest of those private schools to be providing good education, right? That therefore necessarily means that it is the people with the least capital in society that lose out here. So proud, vote proposition.
I'd like to DPM for that speech and welcome DLO to close opening half.
Starting my speech in 3, 2. I think the nuance that OG missed was that there's a specific subset of vulnerable individuals that needed specific needs that weren't being met by the public schooling, because public schooling catered to the largest and most widest demographic possible. Which means to say, you didn't cater towards the religious individuals that needed specific times to go to pray. You didn't allow them to wear their religious clothing when you made them take it off so that you could maintain a guise of secularism. You also made that these individuals that wanted to pursue particular academic pursuits or, like, pursuits in sport didn't have the specific facilities that they needed to be able to train and to succeed and to be better at these things. These were the vulnerable individuals that we needed to protect, because these were the people that wanted to self-actualize the most and needed the most resources in order to do so. Unclear what the harm coming from OG was, but if you wanted to weigh that out, obviously you weigh these particular individuals the highest, because these were the individuals that needed these resources the most. They needed to be protected, especially at a young age, because that was the time they needed to be protected the most, and that was their largest chance of succeeding. What do they say to this? They give 4 responses. First, in terms of the geographical problem, 4 responses here. First, I think there's just alternatives that you can use to remedy this problem. Probably in larger liberal democracies, there's just a probably pretty good network of things like public transport in order to access these things. Maybe commute times are longer, but if you want to say that public schooling was so comparatively worse, maybe it was a trade-off that it was worth making for these individuals. But I think the second thing to suggest is that there probably just is existing schemes that cater towards this. Things like provision of board and room, things like these. And note, I think the framing here is that these are existing schemes that exist, and we just increase the capacity to fund these things. The response here is that you can probably just fund schools outside the city center. Unclear why, the assertion coming from the outside is just you only fund central. Unclear why this was the case. Obviously, you have things like religious schools. You probably have private schools outside the city center, because these were when rich people lived, or these were when the demographics of people wanted schools. Obviously, there were schools outside these areas. But I think the last thing to suggest is that the ideology probably the ideology of Central already being a pretty well-funded school means that we're probably going to target schools outside the city center. Unclear why geography was going to be such a big problem. The next thing they suggest is that the prestige and scholarship of private schools were going to unlock particularly vulnerable individuals out. 2 things here. First, this debate takes place in a very liberal democracy. Unclear why this discrimination necessarily exists, but I think in the instance where you care about things like academic, it was probably pretty optically good for these schools to be able to claim diversity, to be able to claim themselves as the school that led this particular group to success, when they could do things like flaunt their POC and low SES students and treat them well to appear diverse and particularly good and get them to having higher HRs. Probably a pretty good thing optically for them. Unclear what the incentive for them to lock these individuals outward. The third thing to suggest is that most people won't be able to access private schools, and that was why the benefit wasn't good, I guess. Three things to note about this. First, this is just literally mitigation. Sure, maybe we protect a few people on the ground, but these were individuals that you ought to care about the highest. These were individuals that couldn't have accessed the needs that they wanted to the most. Obviously, you cared about these individuals. But I think the second thing to suggest is that prima facie, we could just offer things like scholarships and things like decreased fees for these vulnerable individuals. We just get that we just get a very concrete benefit for these individuals on the ground. But I think the last thing to suggest is that it is a very cyclical thing. You need a vulnerable people within positions of power to continue funding these scholarships in the future. You needed to get them to care about the systems that they existed in, so that when they graduated and when they were alumni, they would have the incentives to care about the systems that led them to succeed in the first place. The comparative was there were going to be lesser, to a lesser degree of success within public schools. They were going to care less about the systems that they grew up in, because these were the systems where they felt the most alienated in. These were the systems where they felt as if they couldn't prosper and they couldn't succeed. And that was when you got the worst schooling out of all. I think the last thing to suggest here is that outcomes here are twofold. First, we simply increase accessibility for these most vulnerable individuals on the ground, people that were poor and people that needed specific needs and couldn't access these things within public schooling. Obviously, we protected these individuals. But I think secondly, just in the long term, you increase accessibility towards things like private school and towards things like religious schools as a whole, in a world where you got alumni to care about these systems, when you got made a larger sum of donations on the outside, because these were the ways in which you increased accessibility for these schools as a whole. Obviously, we better these individuals in the long run. Sure, I'll take closing.
Is the amount of people who'd be getting a scholarship into a private school larger or smaller than the amount of people whose lives would be improved if public school education was?
I'll engage with this later on in my speech. The last thing that I explained here is just that a bulk of their material is then to mitigate our case by explaining that the autonomy wasn't necessarily important, by suggesting that, maybe you maximize parental autonomy but not the child autonomy. Two responses here. First, I'll note that for a lot of children, parental autonomy often is the child's autonomy, because often they know themselves the best and they're probably the ones that care about children the most. They probably have the greatest incentives to want to fulfill a child's autonomy compared. And I think the comparative here is that when you compare these things like public schooling teachers or people that didn't necessarily have the same level of care towards these children, obviously you increase child autonomy on the outside. But I think the second thing to suggest here is just that broad knowledge about what the child cared about was so specifically important, because you knew about things like the child's aptitude for a specific sport. You knew about their hopes and dreams and what they wanted to do when they grew up, and you were uniquely able to fulfill this in a world where you targeted and protected these individuals when they were young. Because no, these dreams can only be realized at a young age, when they were able to enter a training program or when they're able to do things like enter a religious practice, right? But I think the second thing to suggest here is that a lot of these harms are just non-comparative, because the coercion was simply much worse in public schools. Note that the guise of secularism means that for a lot of religious individuals, they simply can't access religious practices, right? And note, this was some material that we brought to you at one and that was simply not responded to. It looks like not having times to be able to go pray. And this was a very important practice for a lot of individuals, but it also looks like not being able to wear religious clothing in public schools and things like France, right? This was obviously really bad for individuals that wanted to access religion and things like that. On the last push on public schools, the large bulk of the case is just to explain why you would worsen public schools when you divert funding. But I know that a lot of the case is very unnuanced in the material that we brought to you at Claire. Because the first thing we explained to you is that the scale of diversion of funds was simply unclear, right? Note that we told you that specialist schools were individuals who were in the minority. These were individuals that didn't need such a substantially large amount of funding comparatively to the amount of funding that we give to public schools. It's unclear why the diversion of funds then was so substantially large. The reason why this was particularly important is in the instance where you're uncertain of the harm under opening government, obviously you weigh the direct and concrete benefits that we bring to you at opening negative. Obviously, at the end of this debate, it was unclear how much you worsened public schools because you were able to sufficiently protect these schools in liberal democracies, and people sufficiently cared about these schools anyways. We uniquely provide those that the system fails, the minorities that needed specific needs that can be allocated to on the side of opening negative. Obviously, vote for.
CO is going to win this debate because we get out of the opening clash about private versus public schools, and we explain that this debate is actually about specialist public schools, that is selective schools, that is sports high schools, and that is performing arts high schools. Because these are the schools that only exist in the choice system. These are the schools that only exist when you think that parents are able to choose special kinds of schools for their children. Because realistically, the amount of kids who are able to access private schools or not in this debate is relatively small. Sure, if the fees get a little bit more expensive, maybe there is a small amount of kids that can no longer access that and no longer get scholarships. But when all of these specialist public schools don't exist, that is thousands of kids who can't go to those schools anymore, and that is thousands of kids who go to actual public schools. So I'm going to do two extensions here. I'm firstly going to explain why it's so important to have other kinds of specialist schools, and I'm secondly going to also win the private school clash by explaining why private schools are going to get far worse without this system. So firstly then to explain why other kinds of specialist schools are so important, and I'm going to separate this argument just by going through all those other types of schools in order. So firstly on sports schools, why these are so helpful. So a few reasons why it is particularly good that sports schools exist. Firstly, sports schools are good because this is just a very direct resources to outcome, this is a very direct way to put in resources to a school and get outcomes. That is to say, you can literally give them sporting facilities that they would not have otherwise, and then those kids are able to do those sports that they love and that they are good at. Because public schools usually do not have sporting facilities, they might have one oval and one hall that maybe caters for two popular sports. They probably don't have sports teachers who are able to teach many other sports, which means that if you're a kid who's particularly good at a sport, particularly if that might be a specific sport, you are just unable to pursue that sport to a very high extent at school. But secondly, also, you're able to be surrounded by other kids who also like sport, who also are competitive and enjoy sport, etc. That means that when you go to those inter-school sports competition, your team's probably going to win, you're going to enjoy that, you're going to feel good about it, and you're just sort of far more able to reach your potential in these things. The impact of this, though, is realistically, probably most of the kids in these sports schools aren't going to be athletes. We don't think that's the important thing, but the real reason that these schools are so important is because they cater to kids, and when you cater to kids in public schools, that is when they stay in school, and that is when they get the most out of the schooling system. That is to say, if you go to a normal public school where you're not able to pursue these sporting things that you care about, where you instead have to do focus on academic things that is maybe not your vibe, maybe not the thing you really enjoy, that is when you don't care about school, that is when you're not engaged in school, and that is when those kids are far more likely to drop out. When you are able to go to a school like a sports school that offers you opportunities that you are able to pursue, that makes you feel like you're supported and feel like your school is helping you reach your potential, where you're surrounded by friends who agree with you and who have similar interests to you, that is when you stay in school, and that was a massive impact for these kids. When you stay in school and when you graduate, that is when you are able to do things like get an ATAR, that is when you are able to do things like finish school and get all the support that comes from going through all the 6 years of school. That was a massive benefit for all those kids. Secondly, on performing arts schools, a lot of the mechanisms here are similar. That is to say that firstly, you just have far more resources to pursue those performing arts things that you enjoy. That is to say that secondly, your school just has the group that you want to do. For instance, maybe you're a dancer, but you specifically love jazz dancing. Most public schools, I don't think, would have a jazz dance group, but I'm sure that Newtown Performing Arts would, because they have so many dancers. You're just able to pursue that thing that you enjoy in school. And thirdly, you're able to access more opportunities and programs through your school. They're probably going to be far more subsidized, and if you were trying to access those opportunities outside of school, they're probably going to be ones that you maybe wouldn't have even noticed outside of school. So those are things that you're going to be able to pursue that will help you improve your passion. And again here, the impact is not that that's going to specifically help those kids become artists or dancers or actors, because yeah, they probably could just go to those programs outside of school in a normal public school. The impact is that that is how those kids get engaged in the school system. That is how the school system helps those kids. That is to say, when they have a school that supports their interests and they feel like that school is helpful for them, that is when they enjoy school, that's when they stay in school. But also, probably for performing arts kids specifically, this is actually just going to really help their school results. That is to say, that if you particularly enjoy dance and music, a lot of schools might just not even offer dance as a HSC subject. At the performing arts school, you can do those subjects that you're suited to, you can do those subjects that you enjoy. So that actually probably just tangibly improves your ATAR. So I've already explained a very substantial group of stakeholders who are going to be far more better off in the school system when they can go to schools that are suited to them. But lastly, I'm going to extend on OG a little to explain why selective schools are actually really good by providing a bunch of unique and specific reasons why it's great that these exist. But I'll take a point from opening.
So buying a swimming pool is expensive. Why is it more important to use that money supporting elite athletes who can access that elsewhere, rather than paying for kids to have science teachers?
But the thing is, you're not supporting elite athletes who can access that elsewhere. You're helping kids, the kids that go to sports high schools are not all elite athletes. They're just kids who are good at sport in primary school and who enjoy sport in primary school, and who probably would have dropped out of sport and stopped swimming if they went to a normal public school where that interest was not supported. Okay, so why selective schools are why it's also really important that selective schools exist. Firstly, they are just very accessible schools. So all of the stuff about how it is unfair if education is like, if you get more of an advantage in private schools, does not exist for selective schools because they are they are public schools by definition, they are free, but also they are becoming increasingly meritocratic in that the actual entrance exams are changing and becoming more based on aptitude. Secondly, and crucially, they allow gifted students to reach their potential because realistically, in a lot of public schools, when you do not have resources, when you are understaffed, when the teachers are unable to help you actually reach what you are able to do, then you're just less able to reach that potential. You're less able to pursue those opportunities after school, and that was a big harm for those kids. In selective schools, firstly, the learning pace is more suited to you. You're less likely to get bored and not care about school. Secondly, you're surrounded by peers who have similar interests to you. And thirdly, you just get far more enrichment opportunities that just mean that you probably enjoy school and you love learning and you have more fun than if you felt bored and too far ahead at another school. And again, in weighing, there are just so many kids that go to selective schools, even if it is only slightly better for them to be in those selective schools, that is already a massive win for CO. Last thing to explain then is why private schools actually, so all of that is a massive group of stakeholders that you should care about because they are vulnerable kids in public schools currently who are not getting the access to the education that they need in this world. But finally, on why private schools actually get far worse in this system, and this is to flip the analysis from OG about how people who leave public schools to go to private schools are going to make public schools worse, because we explain that when those people aren't in private schools get so much worse, and that's really harmful. Why is this true? Firstly, because when these kids were in the world where they have no choice, that means that private schools now do not offer these scholarships. That means that you do not have any First Nations kid in that private school. That means that you do not have any rural kids in that private school who stay there and boarded. That means you probably don't have any low SES kids who came there on scholarships. And that means that big group of middle class kids who could only just afford it now and can't afford it anymore are no longer in that private school. Even if all of these individual scholarships are only a small impact, the combined impact of all of these scholarships is enough to change the culture of private schools. Why does it get better when these kids are there? Firstly, kids in private schools are just exposed to people from different groups they probably would not have been exposed to in other worlds. These are kids who are going through their formative years. These are kids who can now talk to the kid who comes from a farm and understand the issues of rural Australia. They can talk to a person of colour they would not have met otherwise. They can talk to someone who comes from a low SES background. Maybe this is a small change, but it is an important one, given that all teams agree that these are the kids who often end up being CEOs. These are the kids who often end up being politicians. It's far better if they are exposed. Why is this more important than opening government analysis about private schools? Opening government proves why a small group of stakeholders get more access to private schools, but our impact actually affects everyone who goes to private schools, because we explain that private schools have a better culture and become more important on the side of people. So proud to oppose.
I thank Op Member for the speech and welcome Government to close government.
In that 7-minute speech, we heard no direct response to our extension or why it was flawed or why it was wrong. Let me now whip what Never tells you at our member speech before going on to why we come above every other team in this debate. Firstly, Never tells you very compelling material, right, on kind of this principle level. We don't get a response from CO here, Whip is too late. She tells you, right, that this exists very independently of any practical material provided in the opening half of this debate. And in doing so, also beats out any of the opposition's ideas of very what we tell you false autonomy. We tell you education bears very significant moral worth, right, to any individual. It very much fundamentally shapes their knowledge of the world, their identity, and their skills, who they became when they grew up and became a human being. It was so intrinsic to their upbringing that we ought never support assigning monetary value to these schools, and definitely not actively encouraging more people to opt into this system. We think that this is very much aligned to the idea that, like, you know, tertiary education and stuff, it's very, like, unfair to charge such an exorbitant amount for that, right? These were skills that people needed to go on to life. This was so unfair to push people into. Also, we just told you that, like, the increase in, like, money here was, like, particularly harmful for these private schools and, like, specialist schools, because it was just done in a very arbitrary manner. Never tells you about, like, the weird customs and, like, choices and facilities that, like, private schools, like, opt into. Like, private schools even spending, like, thousands of dollars on the flights of their headmasters to, like, get across Australia, not actually the educational outcomes of their students, which is to say that even if you do not believe this material and why the commercialization of education is fundamentally bad, and we should never actively encourage more people to opt into this system, this money was never in the first place well spent. It was never, like, actively benefiting these students. The second thing we tell you, though, is that we actually, like, you know, provide this very, like, vertical extension to our, like, opening about, like, characterizing this middle to, like, upper middle class, because we tell you that these are the people who can directly involve themselves in their, like, kids' schools through, like, the PNC, through lobbying, through, like, persuasion, like, power and persuasion, right? Because they just had more time, money, connections, and, like, bargaining power. So, like, when you got, also, when we tell you, uniquely, when you got less of these people going through the systems themselves, right, they were not as likely to vote for these policies in future, vote for things that we're going to, in the long term, like, help these, like, students improve. I'll take you later. Which is to say, not only do we, like, present you a principle that rises above, like, this opening clash, right, but we provide you with these very tangible and practical reasons for why public schooling actually improves under our side. Beyond just the issue of funding, we tell you concretely why, like, beyond funding, it's important to have those, like, mechanisms of accountability. Okay, let's deal with the other teams in this debate. Firstly, let's start on closing opposition. Basically, their extension is to say that we support schools like selective schools, specialist schools, sports high schools, because these are really helpful for kids who, like, don't care about, like, who aren't as academically inclined. We think it's very, like, interesting to pick the smallest stakeholder in this debate, right? These people were never the delta in this debate, right? These people were always going to be more likely to get scholarships, to, like, get opportunities to pursue these. Even for kids who weren't able to access these, they were always going to be locked out of, like, scholarships to, like, schools where they could, like, go and pursue, like, sports, like, for geographical reasons, or for, like, lack of accountability. No, the fatal flaw in the opposition's case is they don't ever explain to you why it is in the government's interest to send hundreds of thousands of dollars to these schools for, like, dancers and athletes, as opposed to continuing to do what they have done for decades on end, which is just shoveling all of this money into, like, Sydney Grammar, into King's, right? The reasons for this is that these were the schools that their kids attended. These were the schools that their, like, old mates from high school attended. These were probably the schools they went to themselves. They had history and tradition. They were never going to send, like, money to, like, Newtown Performing Arts as opposed to, like, Sydney Grammar School. No, also, we can, like, whip our material again. We just explained to you, right, why public schools are actually important. This is what our opening also does very consistently throughout this bench, which is that it's very just important to provide a fundamental education for kids who can't access it otherwise, for kids who are so, like, disprivileged that they don't have the opportunity to go and learn how to dance and engage with co-curricular activities. Now, at least, you've guaranteed that fundamental form of education for kids who need it the most, for kids where this was their only avenue out of, like, a cycle of, like, poverty or a cycle of disprivilege. We very, very clearly come above closing opposition here. Whip is too late to, like, respond to the extension also we provide you. Let's move on to opening opposition. Opening opposition's articulate main point, right, is kind of this push on, like, increasing autonomy for parents. We tell you that for the parents rich enough to sustain, like, the payment for 5+ years of private or religious education, they will always have this choice to send their kids to these schools, right? We ought not, like, and in the sense, we ought not deprive this autonomy from the vulnerable people, the people OO says they so deeply care about. We tell you the solution is to instead direct this attention to the public school system, because OO provides, like, no tangible or concrete metric by which they send all of their aspiring athletes or religious students who need help to these schools, or, like, to these schools, right? You know, like, schemes, were always going to be accessed by, like, richer people, right? All of these very well-meaning attentions always being co-opted by richer people. For example, the establishment of selective school systems, like, evolving into a system where you just get, like, tutoring and, like, you just get it, like, completely washed, like, you just get, like, richer people going through the system. Yeah.
We explained that in public schools, you couldn't appeal to all demographics, and when you did so, you actively defunded all facilities. How was that not comparatively worse?
When you actively took this money and put it into private school systems,
you made it on net worse for people who would never have the opportunity, for those most vulnerable people who never had the opportunity to access these schools through like scholarships or through schemes, right? Like, yeah, sure, you sent some aspiring athletes off to these schools, but you were never able to help the majority of people. We ought like try and help these people like en masse. Okay, the next thing they tell you though is that public schools are still funded by this metric that the majority of people attend these schools and like hold them accountable. We just don't think this is true. Public schools are already suffering the status quo. Funding is not sufficient. Private schools funding is so substantially larger than public schools, but also necessarily this became worse under their side, because when you supported school choice and you had less money, you just numerically had more private schools, had more like religious and selective schools, where like you had to pour hundreds of thousands of dollars into the establishment of new infrastructure, of new facilities, of like more staffing. They tell you finally that we will fund, like schools will flood their like cohorts with people of color and less wealthy students under the guise of like inclusion. We think this is always going to be flawed, because you were always either going to get those more privileged like POC or like minorities, like having this very false sense of inclusion, or alternatively, this was just done in an incredibly tokenistic manner where you thrust these incredibly vulnerable students into an environment where they could never cope, where they never feel equal to their peers. It was so much better to keep them in the public school system and just better that system, something we tell you we can completely do. Finally, the reason why we get above our opening govern is by explaining our like principally why we should never support this, but also saying that beyond reasons for funding, right, we provide you those accountability mechanisms that tangibly improve the system of public schools.
I think government speech and welcome up with to close this debate, and I'll stop recording as well.